Requesting a Brexit delay he says he doesn't want but is legally obliged to seek, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson formally asks the European Union for more time to finalise divorce plans. Johnson also sending a second letter arguing against the first. Tens of thousands of people take part in protests across Lebanon for a third day of anti-government demonstrations, sparked by perceived cronyism and a stagnant economy. The country's finance minister attempting to defuse the situation by promising a new budget with no additional taxes. And the Chilean president seeks to quell days of violent unrest by suspending a planned hike to the price of metro tickets in the capital. That as the army imposes a nighttime curfew. Hello and welcome to the France 24 newsroom. I'm Haxi Myers-Belkin. Thank you very much for joining us. EU leaders are deliberating on how to respond to a request from the British Prime Minister for a 3-month extension to Brexit. Boris Johnson grudgingly asked for the delay, as he was legally obliged to do, after MPs postponed a decision on whether or not to support his divorce deal. His letter to Brussels was unsigned, but was accompanied by a second letter saying that a delay would be both damaging to the UK and the EU. Luke Shrego has the latest on this most messy of divorces.
I have made it clear I do not want more delay. Text from one of the letters Boris Johnson sent to Brussels on Saturday night, after the British Parliament threw yet another wrench into the Prime Minister's plans to leave the European Union on October 31st, obliging him to seek another extension for 3 months. His defiance following the vote was obvious.
I will not negotiate a delay with the EU, and neither does the law compel me to do so. Further delay would be bad for this country, bad for our European Union, and bad for democracy.
In the first Saturday session of lawmakers since the 1980s, Parliament had voted in favour of an amendment by former Cabinet Minister Oliver Letwin that gives MPs longer to chew over the details of an exit agreement without risking slipping out of the bloc without a deal at the end of the month. And whether for or against Brexit, many Brits were exasperated.
I was hoping that something would be decided. I was hoping that we'd at least take a step in the direction whichever way we were going to go.
Sack everyone, have an election. No, don't allow any of the MPs that are there now stand for Parliament. Let's have 600 and odd new ones completely. How about that for radical?
It leaves the ball in Donald Tusk's court. The European Council President will have to gather the decisions of the 27 other EU heads of state and government in the days ahead of an eventual decision from Brussels.
Barcelona has seen a 6th consecutive night of protests by Catalan separatists, although the demonstrations were less violent than earlier in the week. That as pro-independence activists urged the Spanish government to hold talks to find a solution to the unrest. Barcelona's mayor, meanwhile, pleading with protesters to end the violence almost a week after 9 separatist leaders were handed lengthy prison terms for their roles in a failed bid for independence in 2017. Alison Sargent has the story.
Calls for independence did not die down on Saturday, but tension between Spanish police and Catalan separatists was back at a simmer. The day after violent clashes led to 83 arrests, thousands demonstrated peacefully in Barcelona, surrounded by a heavy police presence.
It's true that the situation is out of control, but it's a result of increased repression.
Barcelona's image can't be one of violence. Many people are tired. The path of peace and dialogue isn't working.
On Friday, more than 500,000 Spaniards gathered in Catalonia's capital, decrying the prison sentences given to a group of separatist leaders convicted of organizing the region's 2017 bid for independence. The rally was followed by hours of violent clashes between police and protesters, who burned trash cans and threw stones that were met with rubber bullets and tear gas. The morning after, Catalonia's separatist president called for calm and for dialogue.
For months, we have asked the Spanish Prime Minister to set a date and a time, to sit around the negotiating table without conditions, to speak and have a discussion.
a dialogar.
By calling for negotiations, Catalan President Quim Torra is also hoping to bring up the possibility of another independence referendum. But the Spanish Prime Minister rejected the Catalan leader's request, saying first, Torra must strongly condemn the violence.
Hundreds of thousands of people have taken to the streets across Lebanon to denounce what they say is the incompetence and greed of their leaders. It's the largest show of discontent yet in a country not used to public protests. People particularly furious at government plans to introduce a series of taxes in an attempt to tackle the country's stagnant economy. Our reporter Nadia Massi has met with some of those protesters in the Lebanese capital, Beirut.
We are in the heart of Beirut tonight. 14 years ago, hundreds of thousands of people filled these streets to mourn their murdered Prime Minister. Tonight, the protesters are back in the streets again, but this time they're protesting against that Prime Minister's son, the current Prime Minister of Lebanon, Saad al-Hariri, a man who these people say has presided over a government that is both corrupt and incompetent.
The poor is getting poorer and the richer is getting richer, so we're trying to change this whole system. I don't trust anyone. The system has always been the same here, you know. I think we need some new blood.
As you can see, all of Lebanon is here. It's our revolution against the government and against corruption.
What can this government change in a few days? The first thing they need to do is take responsibility. They're all just blaming each other. Who will take action?
The Prime Minister has asked these people to give him 72 hours to force through reforms that he says are being held up by his opponents in Parliament. But few people here believe parliamentary reforms are enough. They want to see real change in Lebanon. The word on the street tonight is revolution.
Time now for a look at some other world news stories we're covering for you here on France 24. A so-called Italian pride rally organised by three right-wing parties, the League, the Brothers of Italy and Forza Italia, brought tens of thousands of people onto the streets on Saturday. That mass demonstration called in protest against the government, a coalition forged by the centre-left Democrats and the Five Star Movement, a coalition formed as a result of a crisis triggered by Matteo Salvini, former Deputy Prime Minister and head of the League Party. US President Donald Trump has abandoned plans to host next year's G7 summit at his Florida Gulf resort. That after Democrats and others decried the decision as evidence of the president misusing his office for personal gain. Trump accusing, quote, crazed and irrational hostility from his political rivals as the reason behind his U-turn. And a strike by state rail workers here in France is expected to cause travel chaos for a third consecutive day. That action coming in response to a collision in eastern France between a regional train and a truck that left 11 people injured. A rail union says workers are exercising their right to withdraw in the face of a perceived threat. French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe urging the SNCF train authority to get employees back to work. A senior Kurdish official in northern Syria says that his forces are ready to withdraw from the town of Ras Al Ain if Turkey allows for the evacuation of the Kurdish fighters and civilians from the area. That retreat, a key element of the recent US-brokered truce with Turkey. It's also the first time that the Kurds have publicly acknowledged that they will pull back from the Turkish border, following Ankara's unilateral decision to launch an assault against Kurdish-held positions in the region. Luke Schrager has the latest.
The truce between Syria's Kurds and the Turkish army may only be 2 days old, but both sides have been accusing each other of violating it, though it seems President Recep Tayyip Erdogan cares little either way. Either the Kurds fall 30 kilometers back from the border, or else.
If it happens, it happens. If not, the minute the 120 hours ends, we will start from where we left off and continue to crush the terrorists' heads.
Turkey sees the Kurdish groups to its south in Syria and Iraq as terrorist organizations. It wants a 30-kilometer zone as a buffer, keeping Kurdish forces away from the Turkish border. However, Kurds in the northern town of Ras Al Ain say they're still under siege there, blaming Turkey of trying to cause the ceasefire to fail.
After 2 days of commitment by the Syrian Democratic Forces to the ceasefire agreement, the Turkish army and its mercenaries haven't stopped their intensive attacks, using all kinds of heavy weapons, from airplanes to artillery, on Ras Al Ain and its surrounding areas.
Backed into a corner, the heavily outgunned Kurds had one place to look for help: Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, whose forces have been moving into northern Syria for the first time in years at the Kurds' request to help secure the border. This as concern mounts not just for increasing numbers of displaced and refugees from the renewed fighting, but the thousands upon thousands of Islamic State group-linked detainees that the Kurds have been holding at several camps in the region, whose security is now in doubt.
Chilean President Sebastián Piñera has backed down from plans to increase the price of metro tickets in the capital Santiago, a move that sparked violent protests led by students. Piñera's decision comes less than a day after he declared a state of emergency and as the country's military leader announced a curfew in the capital. Alison Sargent has the details.
5 burned buses, 41 vandalized subway stations, and more than 300 arrests. As protests against a hike in metro ticket prices moved full speed ahead on Saturday, the Chilean president decided to backtrack.
I want to announce today that we are going to suspend the rise in subway ticket prices.
The Chilean government raised subway ticket prices by 4% earlier this month, citing a weaker peso and higher energy costs. The move sparked student-led protests that shut down the capital's subway system on Friday as high schoolers jumped turnstiles and vandalized stations. The president responded by declaring a state of emergency, sending soldiers onto the streets of the capital for the first time since the end of the country's military dictatorship in 1990. The decision didn't sit well with many Chileans, and as protests continued on Saturday, people of all ages came out to show their support.
I do not agree with the return of the military because I lived the dictatorship.
The price hike in public transport was the straw that broke the camel's back. In reality, this protest is also against the miserable pension system.
Just after the president announced the fare hike suspension, Chile's army general declared a curfew in the capital. Santiago's subway system estimates that the protests will cost hundreds of millions of dollars in damage. And even if the demonstrations end, it's not clear when subway service can resume.
Bolivians are heading to the polls for a presidential election that could see incumbent Evo Morales extend his almost 14 years in power. The 59-year-old is leading in the polls, but only narrowly, meaning he could well be facing a December runoff against former President Carlos Mesa. Many voters angry at a string of recent corruption scandals in the country and Morales' refusal to accept a limit on presidential terms. They remained hidden for over 2,700 years, likely buried by a priest rightly afraid of looting. But the 30 ancient wooden coffins recently discovered in the Egyptian city of Luxor have now been revealed to the world. The coffins contain mummies of men, women and children and are adorned with inscriptions and paintings. It's the largest find of its kind for over a century. The coffins will be transferred to the new Grand Egyptian Museum in Cairo ahead of its opening next year. Let's take a listen now.
A cache means something hidden, something that the ancient Egyptians intentionally decided to hide. But from whom? Most probably, during the 21st dynasty, tomb robberies were on the rise, which pushed a leading priest to collect the coffins.
Well, that's all we have time for right now. Thank you very much for watching. There's more news coming up shortly here on France 24. Do stay tuned.